Does sacking Enzo Maresca change anything? That is the question of the day. I want you to answer in the comments below. This is Morning Blues. We're here on Mondays, Wednesdays and Fridays to talk about Chelsea. It's the start of another week. And of course, we're going to be building up to that Brighton game on Friday night, which is huge once again for Chelsea season and for Enzo Maresca. But I feel like today it's a little bit of an assessment, obviously, of what happened on Saturday night. If you haven't seen my review of the Brighton game, please go and check it out. But I'm going to be looking at some of the reactions to that game, some of those tweets and pieces that I've read since then, some of the numbers and stats that have come out that I think are quite revealing about where Chelsea currently are, and trying to have, a more reasonable conversation, right, as we try and do about where Chelsea are and productively where they can go. What are those things that can be fixed, not only between now and the end of the season, but also next season, to try and rectify what feels like a very despondent fan base at the moment, or at least increasingly frustrated fan base. Many people are not only checking out of the season, but kind of are coming to the realization that, who's really responsible for the failings at Chelsea. And right, some of them may come to the conclusion that it's Enzo Maresca. I do think there's a bit of nuance within there. I don't think it's as black and white as, yes, he's at fault, no, he isn't. I think obviously there's more of a nuance within there. But there is obviously so much more at this current moment than just sacking a head coach, because clearly these issues are not just 1 or 2 weeks. These issues have been going on for a very long time. Please like, subscribe, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. We've got a new series starting this week called Beyond the Spin, which I think is a very appropriate title for the current era of Chelsea. That's why I've titled it Beyond the Spin. So please stay tuned for that. It will be coming out in the evenings. It will kind of be a news show where we look back at the reports of the day and try and get to the bottom of them regarding Chelsea Football Club, because there is a lot of spin that goes on currently in the Clearlake Chelsea era. So there was a lot of, I think, great reactions, just very blunt, honest, and I think got to the point reactions of what's the issue at Chelsea currently. And I feel that whatever I say about Enzo Maresca, because I do think there is criticism to be had of Enzo Maresca, there's no getting around it who's ultimately responsible for the failings of Chelsea. And you have to keep saying it, because I think that at times, even from fans or supposed journalists, like there sometimes is distraction over who's actually responsible for this. And I think it is just very obvious. It's the people running the club. It's the people who make the key decisions. And if you talk about in terms of squad building, it's quite clearly the sporting directors. And I think Joe Tweed's a guy who hopefully I'll be able to get back on the show. I had him on years ago, and it was one of my favourite guests on SonOfChelsea. And I think he very much not only has great insight about Chelsea, but I think just gets to the point, but also, gives, I think, great assessments over where Chelsea culturally are. And this is what he had to say post-Saturday, because he also is not someone that, very much rates Enzo Maresca, but I think understands there is something beyond that. And he says, Maresca's struggles are clear, but changing managers won't fix the core issues. The squad is horribly assembled, and the two Burks running the show are the real problem. Too many ineffective forwards and glaring gaps elsewhere. Until that's addressed, any manager will struggle. We've become this lightweight, sulky, entitled group who are fine slapping around pub teams in the Europa Conference, but as soon as things get tough, everyone fades into the background. There wasn't a single iota of leadership on display last night. One of the more disappointing aspects of this current group is just how little leadership and character they have. You can't quantify someone's desire to run and work when things get tough on a spreadsheet. Long-term trends and the people who make long-term decisions should be held more accountable. It's one of the things that was always frustrated me about Chelsea, even in the later years of Abramovich, which have been brought up again to try and, maybe talk about how, it actually isn't that bad at the moment. But, I was critical in the latter years of Abramovich. I think there were many things you could talk about. But, I think that they pale in comparison to Clearlake. But the point I wanted to make was that how things are always in a Chelsea sphere, and I think some of it is kind of psychological and kind of been beaten into us, because things are kind of talked about in like 2-week cycles. The fact that things are kind of talked about in 2-week cycles, and that people kind of have these very short memories where people seem to don't understand that, decisions that were made 9, 12, 18 months ago are impacting the present. And when those decisions were made 9, 12, 18 months ago, it wasn't cool or irrelevant to talk about them, but now they are relevant and cool to talk about. And that's kind of my big frustration. During the summer, I consistently talked about how bad that summer transfer window was, and at the time, I think there were people who are now turning around and maybe have seen more evidence to come to their own conclusions, who didn't want to hear that the squad was being badly assembled, we were making incompetent, baffling decisions, and that Maresca himself as a coach was a wild risk at this time. But of course now it's more relevant, and I hope that is what comes of this, where people realise that the decisions that are made in the long term do have an impact, and it isn't just based on what's happened in the past 2 weeks that is relevant. The past 2 years are very relevant. So I think that Tweeds hits the nail on the head. I do firmly believe that any manager, any coach at the current moment is going to struggle in this current environment, because I just don't think this current environment is sustainable. I don't think it's conducive to a competent and really competitive football team. Like, whether Maresca is good enough or not, I think we can have that separate conversation. But I just think the chefs or the cooks or whatever you want to metaphor you want to use, if the ingredients, if the recipe is flawed, I don't think it matters what recipe you can give that recipe to any cook in the world, like the best chef in the world. I don't think they're going to make it taste any better, to be honest. I think it's always going to be a flawed dish, and I think that's what Chelsea currently are. Chelsea, you've brought this point up because obviously Chelsea's form since Everton has been bad, and that's where I think you can look at the head coach and say you hold some responsibility for this, right? Everton draw, losing to Fulham, losing to Ipswich, draw to Palace. We beat Morecambe, League 2. That's not nothing much to scream about. We should be beating Morecambe. A draw to Bournemouth, a win against Wolves, a loss to Man City, a win against West Ham, and obviously now a loss to Brighton. And one of the things that Chelsea you've pointed out, and others have pointed out, including Tom Coley, who I think did a really good opinion piece for Football London. We'll look at some of the other things he said, but once the Europa Conference League phase ended, it's actually remarkable how bad the form looks, because once you take out those heavy wins and kind of lopsided wins and games where Chelsea have clearly been able to stroll their way to victory with a rotated side and feel good and very low risk, joyful days where you see some of the fringe players play well and things have been able to look good, because on form it looks like we're winning games in a row, but those games should be won because they're against poor opposition. Once those games have been taken out, our form has massively deteriorated, and this does lead on to Tom Coley's piece where he says Chelsea silence speaks volumes for Enzo Maresca, as shocking unspoken statement made. And he says the weekly confidence-boosting goal fests from European football have dried up, taking those out because this expensive Chelsea side are not judged on beating that level of opposition, right? And Enzo Maresca has won 14 of his 28 games in charge. That's taking out the Europa Conference League games. 2 of those have been against League 2 sides, Barrow and Morecambe. And against Premier League teams in all competitions, he has won 12 of 26, losing 7. And he goes on, and I think this is the most damning indictment and really hits the nail on the head of kind of a broader issue. At Chelsea, there is now a culture of no accountability. When things go well, there are plenty willing to take responsibility for the moves that help push things forward. There is nobody who will come out and put their head on the parapet following a defeat or when it looks bad. And I think that is undeniably true. The early victory laps that were being made in November and December against people who, like myself and others, even internal, Chelsea fans who were happy that the team were winning, now looks completely ludicrous. And I have to say, is not unique to this era of Chelsea Football Club. Early wins have been consistent. Asking for major praise for very little has been a consistent theme of the Clearlake era. And I think it kind of summed up that, Chelsea were asking for major praise of how wonderful they were not even halfway into a season, and how quickly that has blown up in their face, speaks to the major incompetence. At times it feels like Clearlake Chelsea is, if it wasn't a football club that means a lot to a lot of people, to millions, to thousands, to those who pay their hard-earned money to go and watch Chelsea, it would be one of the greatest comedies ever written, because the level of incompetence and the way things have consistently blown up in their face in rapid time, it does feel like, wacky. It does feel, slapstick at times. Some of the decision making, especially of Winstanley and Stewart, who are consistently proven to be some of the most incompetent sporting directors in the game. I don't think I'm being unfair by saying that. Just a little bit more on this Conference League stat, because I think it just reveals a lot about where Chelsea actually are this season. Chelsea, you've pointed out, if you take out the Conference League, where Chelsea have routinely fielded teams more expensively assembled than the rest of the competition combined, Maresca has a 50% win rate at Chelsea so far. That is 14 out of 28 games. Pochettino had a 51% win rate when he was sacked. And this is one of the things that concerns me about between now and the end of the season, right, is that I almost fear we're going to get a reverse of last season. And if you remember this time last season, Chelsea was still sort of mid-table. There were still major concerns. And the idea, I've heard people, the backlash about Pochettino revisionism. It's not about Pochettino revisionism. I sat here for a lot of last season being very concerned about where Chelsea were, actually having very similar conversations. And my conversations were pretty much, I think almost 12 months ago, I titled a review for the Wolves game that sacking Pochettino wasn't going to change much. And my fundamental belief was the structure behind him was majorly flawed. We're all making the same kind of opinions right now, which I think tells you a lot about who's actually at fault here and who should be taking most of the blame. But it's about I don't think this season is actually radically better than last year. And I don't think Enzo Maresca is doing a superb job compared to Mauricio Pochettino. Now, is he not doing a superb job because, as we've already said, and as I think is fair to point out, and I do think is a relevant point, the structure behind him is massively flawed, and kind of isn't it quite revealing that you can take two coaches, Pochettino, Maresca, with, in some ways very different experiences, very different actually beliefs in football in some ways tactically, and you're kind of getting the same response. I think tells you a lot. It should tell you a lot about the system. This is something that I've consistently said. If you see different personalities, different players come in and see similar failings, you have to ask and look beyond just who's in the dugout. So it's not about Pochettino revisionism. Pochettino did things wrong, but I think the way people tried to make up the Pochettino leaving was some great victory, I thought was farcical. I did think was farcical, especially the way the season ended. I think it looked like a farce at the time. I still think it does. And I've consistently said if Chelsea fail to get Champions League football, it makes that change completely irrelevant. It makes it pointless. And unfortunately, a lot of the things that Pochettino by the end of the season was arguing and complaining about, I think has only been proven right. When you look at some of the players he highlighted and merited and gave a platform in his team, the likes of Conor Gallagher, who I think now, again, at the time, people didn't want to hear it. Some people wanted to dismiss it. I think Chelsea are a vastly worse midfield without Conor Gallagher. And I think it says a lot that Chelsea's midfield not only looks so lightweight, but our just general vibe in our team lacks intensity. And CFC Daily made the point that, at this point last year for Pochettino, we had a really bad run and really a bad result against Wolves. But then we actually looked at the form between that really damaging Wolves defeat, where things looked to get toxic, between that and the end of the season, things turned around. We made it to a Carabao Cup final, we made it to an FA Cup semi-final, and of course we had that brilliant run right at the end of the season where Chelsea were able to get European football. I guess the question is now, can Maresca fix things? Can he get to a stage and do what Pochettino did and revive something here? I think the concern currently for me is there's limited depth in key areas. I fear that we've had maybe our strongest run of the season, and I also fear, compared to Pochettino, Maresca just objectively as a coach has less experience, and I fear that he doesn't quite have, I think, the same, at least CV, just in terms of evidence, that Pochettino does, that proves to me that he can revive something. I think Pochettino had a lot more ability to work under a difficult ownership, like he did at Spurs. And I think he had more capability to work within that environment and experience of how to get the best out of young players. I'm not entirely sure Maresca does. I think he has to prove that. There's barely any evidence to prove he can. And I also just fear that his style of play is quite dogmatic. And I don't think there is much substance to it beyond the kind of aesthetic possession, positional play. That's what we're going to learn. That's what we're going to figure out about Maresca now. This is where he has to earn his money. Like, he has to prove that there's a little bit more to him than just kind of very standard, very dull kind of possession control ball that I think has come to define a lot of what rakes, and grates a lot of fans currently, is that in the game it feels like there's a a general vibe that everyone has to play this style of football, and I just don't think you have to, and I just don't think it means that you are a smarter football team. I think there are things that Chelsea currently do that make us a worse and dumber football team, personally. So a couple more tweets here, and I think Chelsea youth, again, let's go beyond Enzo Maresca, right? And who's responsible and why Chelsea fans feel disconnected. Because you can look at the current Premier League table and say, oh, Chelsea is still fourth. They could still win the Europa Conference League, which, again, they should win the Europa Conference League. We're all going to be celebrating if we win that competition, and it will be a nice day out. But let's be honest here. If we don't win the Europa Conference League, it's a major embarrassment. It's nothing to write home about and say our season has been a major success. In the current Premier League table, the season is obviously not unsalvageable. We're not in a Tottenham situation, and God forbid, listen, every day you wake up as a Chelsea fan, you should be grateful you're not Spurs. But not being Spurs is not an achievement. It's not something that, oh great, we're not Spurs, that means things are great. No. Like, listen, we should be aspiring far beyond what clubs like Spurs are aspiring for. We should be, with the money we've spent and the expectation and the credit this ownership wanted to give itself before even doing anything, that is where we should be aiming. If you want to be credited for a mythical 100-point team that you haven't even made yet, then that should be the expectation level. And Chelsea Youth, I think, puts it right that I think what rankles most of what a lot of actual fans is that successful or not on the pitch, he says, mostly not. Every decision taken over more than 2 years has been to distance their Chelsea from what Chelsea actually is, means, and will always be. And I think that is also a point where the amount of times I've read pieces that have tried to completely reject what happened before this ownership, when this ownership has done absolutely nothing to even come close to what that ownership was doing in the latter years, it's just insulting intelligence. And that is something, if people want to know why the mood inside the ground is getting worse, if people want to know why people are consistently turning against this ownership and maybe venting their frustration in ways that you don't find productive, consistently say, why does that happen? Why have we reached this stage? And it's because the decision makers have not only objectively in front of them made a squad that has been worse, people just brutally and honestly, these are the facts, have looked at a squad and looked at a club that has been ripped out, and so much has been changed personnel in a very short period of time, and things have got objectively worse. That is undeniable. We didn't go 2 years in the Abramovich era without winning a trophy. We haven't won a trophy under Clearlake yet. We haven't won a domestic trophy, what is it now, since 2018. We've been knocked out of the fourth round in both competitions this year. That is something that you would just never see under the Abramovich era. At least in one of those competitions, we'd go all the way and win it, or we'd be, serious and competitive. The transfer strategy seems to be making us weaker every window, not stronger. Again, that is something that, with my frustrations, I don't think you could ever seriously argue, at least in a way where I could look at a squad and go, well, there's like literally no midfield depth now if some of our players get injured. I think at some point we did have depth. It's whether that depth was great enough, but we were still getting Champions League football consistently. That is something that, this ownership hasn't achieved yet. So until they do that, we can't even have a comparison between the closing Abramovich years, where we still won a Europa League, we still won an FA Cup, we still won a Club World Cup, and of course we won a Champions League. Those are things that we're talking on different planets of competence here. The frustrations had in the latter Abramovich years were I think valid, but we're not even on the same planet. So we're talking about, very different frustrations and very severe frustrations. George Smiley is an account that I definitely respect, and I think to get more productive to round out today's show, for next season, the following needs to happen by Clearlake, Todd, and others in the shadows. And he brings up 5 points here that I think are very valid, and I want to hear your thoughts in the comments. Sort their pathetic infighting out. That is clear, because that's gonna only get worse, I think, now, because things are getting bad again, and the briefing and counter briefing only makes Chelsea look more like a farce, not better. Whether we think Todd Bowley is better for Chelsea and actually cares about a winning team more than Benedict Barley, which I do, he's still part of this ownership, and the Vivid Seats controversy last week, he still bears responsibility for that. That should not just be swept under the rug. Whether that story came from in nefarious ways to maybe, if you want to, even if that story in nefarious ways came to try and undermine criticism or try and take away criticism from the current group, well, it's failed within a couple of days. We had the Brighton result, and the frustration has gone right back to where it was before. He still has responsibility for that, and I think all of this is a mess. Number 2, better sporting structure and slimlined less is more. Absolutely. And I think this combines with number 3, better sporting directors. Absolutely. They should be gone. Number 4, town hall of fans on vision and no smoking mirrors. Completely agree. I think the lack of communication, the amount of communication to favoured media outlets whilst having barely any communication to fans is something that I think grates with people as well, because it's very easy to put out a briefing that makes you look great, but actually taking serious questions from the stakeholders of the club, from supporters that you claimed you cared about when you took over in 2022, I think would be just communication. I understand the retort from some people is people will reject it anyway, but they've created this situation. They could have done a lot more early on, especially in that first really bad season under when we had Graham Potter. Right, I felt strongly they should have said something then. The fact they haven't, and we've got to a stage now in the year of our Lord 2025 when they still haven't communicated that, I think speaks volumes. I think it shows a sign of not only tone deaf, but just you get the sense that they are so believing and trustworthy of their own kind of bubble, and they believe they're so great and perfect. They don't need to listen to plebs. They don't need to listen to these silly fans. They don't need to listen to people who, maybe don't understand their project, don't understand their wisdom, or at least explain it to us. Maybe that helps, maybe that doesn't, but I do think more communication with actual fans rather than briefs that make you look better, I think would be helpful, because the briefs the word briefs has become kind of the word of the season now. Briefings has become the word of the season now for Chelsea fans. People have seen past it. They don't believe what's being written. They don't take it at face value anymore. They know there is a strategy behind it of PR, of trying to spin things. That should ring alarm bells, because I think for a lot of other clubs, maybe that isn't the case. Maybe that hasn't been the case before for Chelsea. The fact that so many people now just look at every report that comes out of Chelsea, where insiders are talked about, sources inside the club, and people just, instantly reject it, should tell you a lot about how much that strategy has failed and how ludicrous it looks now. And number 5, take this club seriously. That is, if I want to end the show on one thing, that is the clear thing. If your objective and your primary goal is to not make a better football team, what are we doing here? Especially with the money you have. It's not like Chelsea are on their knees, for at least from what we can tell, to a point where like you're a League 2 team nearly going out of business and you have to sell all your best players or you're not going to survive anymore. That's clearly not where Chelsea are, because Chelsea are still spending money. They've spent money very liberally in recent years to a ridiculous point. So the idea Chelsea are spending pittance is again an insult to fans, to try and spin it somehow. What could we do other than fail? It is not an excuse when you look at the objective reality of the money that's been spent. And I do think whatever you say about Maresca in the comments, I think you have to answer this question too. This is my second question of the day to wrap up the show. If it's not about making a better football team, if you walk out of every transfer window being weaker, if so many incompetent squad building decisions that makes no sense to any logical football brain continues, how does that help the head coach? How does that make us a better football team? How do we ever get out of this current rut? Because I think Chelsea have enough finance. I mean, it may change over a period of time, but I think Chelsea will have enough finance to buy a certain level of player to get us in the top 10, to get us in the top 7 or 8. But is it about ever going beyond that? I'm not entirely sure. And that's why I think there is a feeling of hopelessness at the moment. We'll be covering whatever goes on. I do think there's a lot more to say about how Chelsea, probably from a PR point of view, are going to react to these reactions from Chelsea fans, this growing resentment that has only got louder, and I think will continue to get louder the worse results get. So give me your thoughts. Have a great Monday, and I will see you again very soon. All the best.